The whispers in Final Fantasy VII Remake are a meta plot point. I think it's fine to have a meta element to your narrative, but in my opinion, it shouldn't detract from the story's internal logic. The problem with Final Fantasy VII Remake is not that they made changes in the first place, but it's more that the meta-narrative doesn't mesh very nicely with the game's narrative. The original Final Fantasy VII takes the characters Cloud, Barret, Tifa, Ares, and Red 13 to the end of the Midgar Expressway. That's where Final Fantasy VII's adaptation ends, and it starts adding new elements. And this is also the exact point that the characters in the remake stop acting like characters.
Destiny's Crossroads.
Then why did you stop me?
I'm not really sure.
Aerith asks them to go through a portal to defy fate, but it's not clear what the consequences for that are for the characters. What is Cloud's motivation to step through the portal to defy fate? What is Barret's motivation? It doesn't follow on from anything that we've learned about these characters before. They just say yes because that's what the plot needed them to do. And this plot element doesn't carry on from everything that we've done in the game so far. The main villains of Final Fantasy VII Remake are Heidegger, Hojo, President Shinra. The entire plot has been leading up to fighting them. That's what Barret's motivation has been about from the beginning. That's why Tifa is in the story. And then Sephiroth comes in. And fighting him doesn't tie into any of that. At least not directly. Of course, it does all tie together eventually in the original game. But we're trying to write a climax and a conclusion to this part of the game, to part one of the remake. And Sephiroth and the Arbiters of Fate don't really do a good job of that. It feels very similar to me to Game of Thrones, where they ran out of material to adapt and they just didn't really know what to do with the pieces that they had in their hands. There are a few other oddities in the conclusion of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Of course, in the original game, you meet Red 13 in the Shinra building. That means Red 13 is introduced quite late into the plot of Remake and doesn't really have a lot to do. And then you have the Zack stuff.
Boy, oh boy.
So the big change to the story that occurs as a result of Cloud and the party defeating the Harbinger of Fate is that Zack is perhaps alive in some way, survives his fight with the Shinra troopers. Obviously this is huge if you've played Final Fantasy VII and you know about the series story. But for someone who's new to this series and is just playing Final Fantasy VII Remake, that makes no fucking sense. Like, who is this guy? Why is he in the ending all of a sudden? It's just such a bizarre way to end an entire game. Even though Final Fantasy VII Remake is going to be a trilogy, and so we know there's going to be a sequel, like, each game has to work as a self-contained story. And all of these elements that were added at the end of Remake just really make it fall apart as its own thing. So the question I was asking myself is there a better way to execute on the Final Fantasy VII Remake ending? That means we have to keep the Defiance of Fate storyline additions, but we also have to remake the original story as closely as possible. Now, this presents quite a big challenge, as you might have already realized, because you can't really keep an extremely faithful adaptation whilst also having the characters challenge fate to be able to change the course of history, right? These two ideas are in perfect opposition to each other. They're a contradiction. But I do think there's a way that we could have tied them together a little bit better than the Final Fantasy VII Remake, the released game, did. And, well, tell me what you think. This is what I have. Okay, so a few things to consider here. First of all, we don't want the Harbinger fight to come right at the end of the game. That feels tacked on, and it doesn't fit in with the rest of the core story. So we're just going to move the Harbinger fight earlier in the story. Defeating the Harbinger allows the party to accomplish something in the main plot. Simple. That's what allows us to better integrate the meta-narrative, the Defiance of Fate storyline with the original core Final Fantasy VII plot. We also have to think about how we're going to end the game. So the place they decided to end the game is when the party leave Midgar. That makes sense. That's a natural place to end Remake Part 1. One small issue with that is that Motorball is not really an ideal final boss for this storyline, if you're thinking about it as one game with a beginning, middle, and end. Escaping the Shinra building and then fighting Motorball and then credits roll, not ideal. But Sephiroth, I think, does kind of fit in with this part of the story, because in the original Final Fantasy VII, the party are very close to meeting Sephiroth. Sephiroth reaches President Shinra's office just a little bit before them, so they're very close to crossing paths anyway. So maybe we actually can, in a natural way that honours the original story, allow Cloud and the party to meet Sephiroth and have Sephiroth be the final boss. So if the party are going to defeat the Harbinger and change the course of the original game, then something needs to change in the plot. Now, in the released remake, what changes is that Zack Fair is maybe alive, but that's confusing, so we're going to throw that out. Let's choose something else significant to change instead. It could be something like President Shinra, who dies pretty close to the end of the Midgar section of the original Final Fantasy VII. Maybe he survives. And if we're fighting Sephiroth, then let's say that Sephiroth dies, or a version of him. He dies as far as we know, and Shinra survives. That's like a reversal of what happened in the original game. So now all players know something significant has changed, but we're still pretty close to honouring the spirit of the original story. That allows us to do something else that's quite cool, which is to allow Barret to actually have his final standoff with President Shinra. Now, Remake tries to do this a little bit. In the original Final Fantasy VII, Shinra is already dead when the party gets there. In Remake, he's alive for a little while, and Barret and Shinra have a little standoff. That's really cool. Barret demands that Shinra goes on TV and clears Avalanche's name.
You're gonna get on TV and tell him. Tell him what you did to Sector 7. That it was you who killed all those people.
I think that's something they should actually do. That's a pretty cool conclusion to the storyline of Remake. That's a great way to give at least this one small aspect of the game a kind of a happy ending. A great way to have an ending for Remake, but to still allow the story to continue in Remake Part 2. So this is a way that Remake can improve on the original, give Barret his final confrontation with Shinra, allow him to achieve something, give this Shinra storyline in Remake, which has been the majority of the story for this whole game, a happy ending. This is the right time to do it. I'm just going to read this out very straightforwardly, and I'm not going to add too much detail or context, if I can avoid it. Okay. Cloud and the gang are working their way through the Shinra building. They run into Sephiroth a few times, but the Whispers keep them from meeting. The Whispers hide Sephiroth, or they push Cloud and Sephiroth apart. Now Cloud and the party get close to the top floor. At this point, the Whispers have fully surrounded the building and completely block the party from further pursuing Sephiroth or entering the President's office. So what's happened here is that the party is ahead of schedule. Sephiroth hasn't killed the President yet, so the Arbiters of Fate have to stand in their way and delay Cloud and the party. But they won't give up. This is what they have been fighting the entire game for. This is Barret's life's work, and this is what Cloud has come to believe is right. So they won't be stopped. Red 13, who has some mystical knowledge of the cosmos, reveals that they can defy fate and fight the Arbiters. They can defeat the Harbinger and make the Whispers devolve. So that's what they do. This allows the party to catch up with Sephiroth before he kills President Shinra, and they fight in President Shinra's office. Meanwhile, Red 13 sits on President Shinra's chest, stops him from fleeing and calling for help. The fight between Cloud, Barret, Tifa, Aerith, and Sephiroth progresses to the helipad, up the side of the building and to the roof. Eventually, Cloud knocks Sephiroth's sword from his hand. President Shinra takes a chance to grab the sword and stab Sephiroth in the back with his own sword. So Sephiroth, seemingly dead at this point. This means that they save President Shinra, who they then force to go on TV and reveal the truth about Avalanche and the bombings. Hojo is missing, but Rufus does show up, and he and President Shinra tell Avalanche that Genova is missing. Avalanche and Shinra come to some sort of agreement. Shinra agree to some of Avalanche's demands as long as Cloud, Barret, and Tifa leave Midgar to retrieve Genova. So there's an uneasy ceasefire at this point. but it does let the party go back to the slums. Barret gets to say goodbye to Marlene and to the other members of Avalanche. I think perhaps Wedge is put in charge of the Sector 7 Avalanche cell. And now with the party loosely working with Shinra, they drive peacefully along the Midgar Expressway to the end of the city, and that's when the credits roll. So what are the problems with this rewrite? Well, there are some pretty big ones. First of all, you lose some iconic moments from the original. So this rewrite doesn't have the fight with Rufus on the helipad. I tried to kind of replace it with a fight with Sephiroth on the helipad. That'd be pretty cool as well, but Rufus is cool. It's a shame to lose him. Then you don't have, and this is a big one, you don't have the motorbike escape sequence, which is like the most iconic thing in the Midgar section of the original game. So that's huge. I can imagine that anyone that suggested a remake of Final Fantasy VII without the motorbike escape is going to be laughed out of the room. So this is one of the reasons that something like this, that more dramatically changed the ending of the Midgar section of Final Fantasy VII, wasn't made. But that's kind of tells us what the key problem is, what the challenge that Nomura and the remake team were dealing with, which is they were trying to have their cake and eat it. That's a really good way to describe what they were doing here, is that they couldn't change anything. They couldn't leave any iconic moments of Final Fantasy VII out, a game which is full of iconic moments, by the way. And yet they wanted to do something different to build excitement for a new type of remake and a new storyline going forward, and build hype for the sequels. What direction is the story going to take? So they were kind of doing something impossible, and I think the only way to make it work as not a self-contained story, but, you know, a coherent first part of the trilogy that doesn't rely on meta-narrative, is that they had to make changes. You know, they had to say, if Cloud and Tifa and Aerith and Barret and Red are going to defeat the Harbinger of Fate and allow them to rewrite their destiny, then there have to be changes to the story, right?
I take advantage of whatever I can and discard that which I cannot. There is no room for sentiment or guilt.
So these are the changes I would have made, but what do you think? Does this work for you? Does it work for the series? How would you have changed the ending for Remake? Are there any changes to the original Final Fantasy VII that you would have liked? I'm sure people will have a bunch of good ideas in the comments, so let's have a look below, and I'll see you next time.